Okay, good morning, everyone. I'm Brian Taylor. I'm professor of urban planning and public policy in the Luskin School of Public Affairs, and I direct the Institute of Transportation Studies here at UCLA. I want to welcome you to the last part of the UCLA Lake Arrowhead Symposium on the Transportation Land Use Environment Connection, Transit and Transition. I want to begin with an acknowledgement. The UCLA Institute of Transportation Studies, which presents this UCLA symposium, acknowledges the Gabrielano and Tongva peoples as the traditional land caretakers of the Tvangar, the Los Angeles Basin, and the Southern Channel Islands. As a land-grant institution, we pay our respects to the Hunukvatam, ancestors, Ahihiram, elders, and Ihin Kem, our relatives and relations past, present, and emerging. So this is a hybrid arrowhead for hybrid times. Until the pandemic, the UCLA Lake Arrowhead Symposium, as many of you know, consisted of 9 content sessions spread over 3 days, interspersed with meals and social engagement time. It's a tradition that's been alive for 3 decades. This year's symposium also consists of 9 substantive sessions, but instead it's spread over 6 months and interspersed with, well, everything else in life. 6 months ago was before the Omicron variant and yet another difficult winter. And today we're focusing less on the shock of the pandemic and its effect on public transit and more on what lies ahead for the mode. A little bit on where we've come so far. So this is a bit like, now, where were we with Ozark or the marvelous Mrs. Maisel? I mean, when we left off. So I want to give you a little bit of a catch-up here. So we began back in late September 30th, with our first session, which was Transit Before and During COVID-19. It was moderated by Reagan Patterson, who was at the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation. She's actually starting as a faculty member in UCLA this July, working on environmental justice and transportation. And presentations were by yours truly and Carrie Watkins of the Georgia Institute of Technology. We talked about transit leading up to the pandemic and looked at sort of eroding ridership and what some of the causes were behind that. Talked a lot about increasing access to automobiles, either increased auto ownership or through Uber and Lyft. And also the trauma early on in the pandemic and the halting return where the riders who were lost were disproportionately higher income riders traveling to downtowns and other areas. And those who were remaining riding tended to be lower income, more likely people of color, and traveling in different patterns than had happened before. Our next one was about money and finance, and certainly that was an enormous issue early on. Our panelists were Asha Weinstein-Agrawal of the Medetta Transportation Institute at San Jose State University, Michael Pinmantel of the California Transit Association, and Robert Puentes of the Eno Center for Transportation in Washington, D.C. And there we talked about how there was a certain irony that high fare box recovery systems were struggling the most financially because they had the biggest drops in funds. Those that tended to be lower fare box recovery systems were faring well. And also that there was just an enormous public policy achievement in the financial rescue from the federal government with 3 separate bills. But we saw more worrisome signs on the horizon, and that's sort of where we left that. We then had a session a week later, on October 14th, entitled Transit for People. That was moderated by Tara Bills, who joined us in January as a faculty member in public policy and civil and environmental engineering. And David Bragdon at the Transit Center, Therese McMillan of the Metropolitan Transportation Commission in the San Francisco Bay Area, and Jessica Meany of Investing in Place. And David talked about the equity dashboard that the Transit Center had developed so that one could analyze sort of the distributional effects from many dimensions for public transit. Therese talked about their equity platform and how they were trying to weave that into almost all aspects of the planning activities they were doing. And Jessica, we're going to hear more from later today. On the following Thursday, we talked about Transit Now, essentially the idea of thinking about what was going on with transit at that moment. With that, we had Doran Barnes from Foothill Transit, the general manager there, and we had 3 speakers from the Federal Transit Administration, Felicia James, Bruce Robinson, and Veronica Vanderpool. And there we talked quite a bit about the federal government's enormous pivot from a largely capital program to one where they were almost overnight funding operations and maintenance, and how they'd sort of made that transition, how they had allocated the money, and sort of what their responses had been. Then finally we pivoted at the, I believe this was the last of those sessions on transit's future, and that's really going to be where we're going to pick up today. There we had Susan Shaheen from the UC Berkeley ITS Resilient and Innovative Mobility Initiative, and we'll hear from her in just a moment. Jeffrey Tumlin from San Francisco Municipal Transportation Agency, MUNI, for those of you from outside the area, and Jacob Wasserman, who's going to be moderating today as well. And since we're going to pick up on that, I'll talk about it a bit more. All of these are available at UCLA Arrowhead Symposium.org as YouTube, and if you want to go back and see any of those, they are available to be viewed. And also for those of you who are certified planners, these are available for free CM credits for those who are interested in that. We then had an in-person event following those series, and it was in honor of the founder of this series back in the late 1980s, Martin Wax, who passed away unexpectedly last October 12th. There were a variety of, it was heavily attended by longtime participants in the Arrowhead program, and we sort of honored Marty's contribution in helping to create this series. His family was able to attend, and it was a very nice evening for those of you who were there. Now, coming out of that fall series, some issues I think are going to animate our discussions today, and I want to just go over a few of them. This is far from a complete list, but I would like to highlight a few. First, we know that travel on other modes has recovered faster and more fully than on public transit. So it begs the question, how will the demand for transit service unfold in the years ahead, and what should be done in public policy broadly and by transit systems in general to respond to that and in terms of seeking a return of ridership. The second is that the share of riders with low incomes and who are people of color has increased during the pandemic. I actually don't think that's not because low-income people are riding more, it's because more affluent riders and white riders are riding a lot less, and it's changed the composition of who's on transit. So that raises the question of how should systems respond to these less advantaged riders and their shifting patterns of demand, because many times we have structured systems around big demands in central cities, and the patterns may be somewhat different now moving forward. A third is that the industry has mostly weathered challenging financial times, but that's so far. And there's still more fiscal uncertainty on the horizon. We've done some research at UCLA where operators tell us, we're pretty good for now, for the most part, but when our federal support runs out, and if we haven't had the recovery of riders we're hoping, we are looking at some treacherous waters ahead. And now we have labor issues. It's an enormously important issue within transit systems and become front and center, and we're going to discuss more of that today as well. And finally, macro transit and new mobility services have also faced significant pandemic challenges and quickly became sort of essential parts of the transportation system. What lies ahead for these services, and particularly vis-a-vis traditional public transit? How will they complement, conflict, and interact with public transit moving forward? These are going to be done, as I mentioned, in these 4 sessions. We're going to start with broader trends affecting the demand for transit. That's going to be moderated by Evelyn Blumenberg, who's the director of the UCLA Lewis Center for Regional Policy Studies. And we have UCLA faculty members Michael Manville of UCLA Luskin, Jerry Nicholsberg of the Anderson School and the Anderson Forecast, and Deborah Salin from Arizona State University. That's going to be immediately following this. Then I have the honor of interviewing essentially 3 key leaders in transportation in Southern California: Stephanie Wiggins, who is the CEO of LA Metro, Salita Reynolds, the general manager of LA DOT, and Kome Ajize, who is the executive director of SCAG. If you have questions or want to participate in polls or ideas, you can get onto slido.com, use hashtag Arrowhead, and can participate. You can submit questions all throughout the day. You can vote on questions. You can share your ideas on improving transit and ways to grow ridership in the coming decade. And we can discuss those further in the concluding session. We will have lunch out here on this lovely patio behind me. I believe that's correct. I'm getting a thumbs up. It has terrific views. Unfortunately, as I was coming in, we were listening to how we're having unseasonably cool weather, but it will be in the mid-60s today. We're having unseasonably warm weather next week. But it is a really nice place that we'll be able to socialize. One other thing to mention, UCLA's policy is that that beginning on April 11th, masks will be optional indoors, and this is April 1st. So the current policy is that if someone is actively speaking and away from others, as I am now, or if you're eating or drinking, it's fine to be mask off. But indoors, the UCLA policy is that people are to wear masks, but during lunch, obviously outdoors, won't have to. And on April 11th, that will all be consistent then with LA County policy. That afternoon, we have a session, as I mentioned, on key issues in labor and finance. We're going to have the aforementioned Jessica Meany, Conan Chung of LA Metro, Joshua Shank, who is now with us at ITS as Senior Fellow, Michael Pimentel from the California Transit Association, and our own Jacob Wasserman will be moderating that session. Finally, the penultimate session will be COVID Disrupting Disruptive Mobility, which I didn't make up that title, although I wish I had. That is going to include Ann Brown of the University of Oregon, Harry Campbell, the rideshare guy, Alyssa, and I'm not sure the pronunciation of her name, Hurley. If she could correct me if I've gotten it wrong, and Michael Manville will be moderating that session. Then finally, we'll close with a short session where we are able to kind of offer comments and thoughts, pulling all of these together as we go forward. So to begin, we have actually two short remote presentations. The first is from Professor Susan Shaheen, and she's going to talk briefly about the UCITS, which is the 4 branches RIMI program that's just getting underway that we're very excited about. And the goal is very much to do research relevant to professional practice, and so we're going to share that with you now.
Good morning. My name is Susan Shaheen, and I'm the director of the Resilient and Innovative Mobility Initiative of the UCITS. The University of California Institute of Transportation Studies is comprised of 4 UC campuses: UCLA, UC Berkeley, UC Davis, and UC Irvine. The Resilient and Innovative Mobility Initiative, or RIMI, is delighted to be a sponsor of today's UCLA Lake Arrowhead Symposium meeting focused on transit and transition. While I'm unable to join you today, several members of the RIMI team are with you in the audience, and we look forward to a conversation around critical issues in public transit, particularly as we transition coming out of COVID and into this recovery period. We look forward to the conversation that will feature important topics like labor shortages, remote work, impacts of COVID-19 on public transit's recovery and shared mobility, transit finance, and more. I'd like to take a moment to introduce you to the RIMI program. RIMI is a new initiative that was funded by the state legislature. It's a one-time program with 3 years of funding, and we're getting started. And one of our key activities is sponsoring this event and being part of the conversation about how to move California forward in terms of public transit and shared mobility. Alongside public transit and shared mobility, we have 2 other key pillars, one focused on carbon neutrality and the third focused on emerging tech and innovation. An exciting component of this initiative is that all three pillars have two cross-cutting themes: equity and high-road jobs. As part of public transit and shared mobility's leadership, Brian Taylor and myself have developed a program alongside our partner campuses that focuses on 5 key themes in public transit, including reviving public transit, the public role of private shared mobility, improving policy and operations, resilience and emergency response in public transit, and finally, transit and shared mobility's role in environmental policies. Again, we're delighted to sponsor this event today. We look forward to interacting with you. If you have questions or comments around public transit and shared mobility, please share those with the RIMI team. And we hope you have a truly successful event and look forward to an ongoing conversation with you around the critical role that public transit plays in our state.
Okay, and next we have a video message from Nuria Fernandez, who is the administrator of the Federal Administration.
Hello, and thanks for the invitation to address you at the UCLA Arrowhead Symposium. Let me start by acknowledging Director Brian Taylor and Deputy Director Juan Matute. We really appreciate the work by UCLA in bringing us all together to discuss transportation, land use, and ways that we can apply transit research. At the Federal Transit Administration, we encourage partnerships between researchers and our industry to promote and advance innovations that forge a path to a successful future for transit across America. At USDOT, we continue to invest in new technologies that offer solutions to help public transit agencies transform and evolve so they can meet the new expectations of current and future riders, including enhancing both mobility and equity, improving sustainability, including fighting climate change with zero-emission technologies, and improving the safety of everyone practicing active transportation as a first-mile, last-mile mobility option, whether as a pedestrian, a cyclist, or roller, to connect to a bus or rail system. FTA and USDOT have identified several innovation and research areas for our future work. Those include transit automation, mobility for the underserved, technical assistance for transitioning fossil fuel buses to a low or no emissions propulsion systems, and research into new, safe systems, advanced technologies. Another one of our department's innovation principles is collaboration, and we're doing so across all modes on everything from processes that will improve safety to approaches that will help deliver a more sustainable and equitable transportation network. An example of this is FTA's work with the Federal Highway Administration to issue a new joint planning guidance that will help facilitate and speed project delivery for highways and transit projects. We now have a once-in-a-generation investment in transportation infrastructure in the form of the President's bipartisan infrastructure law, and we are armed with more tools and funding to expand and modernize to create a more equitable transit systems. I urge all of you to come together and think how to make transit more accessible in your own communities, from big picture analyses to on-the-ground real experience conversations, and analyze how decisions in the past may have left parts of your communities disconnected and underserved by transit. Because now, with the increased federal funding support, you can plan and deliver new rail and bus lines. You can upgrade or launch bus rapid transit lines and streetcars, and you can improve ferry systems. While we build a new transit future, we will fix what we have now, addressing the maintenance backlog and making stations more accessible to everyone, no matter their ability. FDA will work to ensure transit agencies throughout California touch more people and places. Our goal is to help make transit the most affordable and convenient way for people to get around, to go to work, to school, to medical appointments, and to visit friends and family. The future is indeed promising, although this is going to take continued support from all of us. I hope that during this conference, you generate many good ideas about the future of transit as we seek to grow ridership and recover from the impacts of the pandemic. Have a great symposium, and thank you.
Okay, now we're ready to start the first substantive session. So I'm going to ask the panelists to come forward and take your seats at my left, and invite Evelyn Blumenberg, the moderator of this first session, to come up and start things. Thank you very much, and welcome to Arrowhead. Sort of.
I don't know. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the first panel session of the day. It's so great to be in person, and at least for a few minutes to be maskless. I find that I fog up the moment I have my mask and my glasses on. Like Brian mentioned, my name is Evelyn Blumenberg. I'm a faculty member in urban planning in the Luskin School of Public Affairs, and I also direct the Lewis Center for Regional Policy Studies, also in the Luskin School. And so I'll be moderating the session, which is sponsored by ARUP and the UC Davis National Center for Sustainable Transportation. So thanks to both of these organizations for their support. As advertised, the panel is going to do some context setting. So we're going to focus on the trends that have affected the underlying demand for public transit. So the choices that individuals are making about where to work and where to live, the choices that employers are making that affect workers, but also development, and of course the political choices and the role of public policy and regulation. And so to talk about these issues and themes, we have three terrific panelists. I'm going to, I think Brian already did a bit of this, but I'll briefly reintroduce them to you in the order that they'll be speaking. And then, as I understand it, you have their complete bios as part of the materials for this day. So first up is Deborah Salon. Deborah is an associate professor of transportation planning in the School of Geographical Sciences and Urban Planning at Arizona State University, where she also is the associate director of their University Transportation Center. Then up is Jerry Nicholsberg, and he is with the UCLA Anderson School of Management and is the faculty director of the UCLA Anderson Forecast. And then third up is Michael Manville, and he's an associate professor of urban planning in the UCLA Luskin School of Public Affairs. So this is how this panel is going to be structured. So each of the panelists is going to speak for about 12 minutes. I'm going to kick things off with a couple of questions, and then we'll turn things over to you all for questions. And we will be operating in Slido. So make sure you are operational in Slido and start sort of posting your questions. And I'll remind you periodically about that. So I'm going to now turn things over to Deborah, who's going to be speaking on trends in telecommuting, remote work, and travel behavior.
Got it. Awesome. Thank you very much. Thanks, Evie, and thanks to everyone who was on the panel that invited me. I'm really happy to be here, so thanks for inviting me and allowing me to be part of this. So I am going to be talking about some research that I've done with a team of people, both at Arizona State University and at the University of Illinois at Chicago. The research was funded by a whole bunch of different funding organizations, but probably most importantly, the National Science Foundation kind of kicked things off, and we got subsequent funding from a few other places that are listed here. And what I'm going to be focusing on today is the title up there, how will the COVID pandemic affect public transit demand into the future, which I think is a big question that we all have in this room, right? So just a little background first on what the data look like, where they come from, that I'm going to draw on to try to begin to answer this question. So COVID-19 obviously required most of us to make large changes to our daily lives, and especially related to transportation. And we conducted a survey, national survey, to try to understand how this experience will affect transportation choices into the future in the United States. And so we call our survey the COVID Future Survey. If you want to find out more about it, we do have a website, covidfuture.org, and you can go there, see what, some of the stuff we've done. We've written blog posts, we've published a few papers, and you can also download our data, at least the first wave of it. I can speak more about that later if people are interested. This is just to show you, it's not just my work. This is the work that was done by quite a number of people, so just a few smiling faces of the rest of the research team. So what was in the survey? The survey asked questions about employment, about commuting, and then about other types of travel. I'm really going to talk about the employment and commuting pieces of the survey today, but it does have all these other pieces to it as well, if you wanted to dive in yourself. The survey took between 15 and 30 minutes for people to take, and we implemented 3 waves of this survey. The first one began in April 2020 and went through October 2020-ish, and we collected about 9,000 responses during that period. The second wave started in November 2020 and went through April 2021, and we collected about 3,000 responses. And the last wave was just this past fall, October, November 2021, and we collected another 3,000 responses. And those second and third waves are a panel, right? So that we only re-invited the people who took the survey the first time, and so we can actually compare those people's individual responses from what they said earlier in the pandemic to what they said later in the pandemic. And so that's part of what I'm going to be reporting on today. Just to give you an idea of where our respondents came from, in wave 1, that larger sample, this is what the spatial distribution of the survey respondents looked like. And you can see that we have a large oversample in Arizona, where I am based. But beyond that, I think the survey sample largely reproduces sort of the places where we have a lot of people in the United States. We did weight the data, though, to deal with any non-representative issues, such as a super large sample in Arizona. And so we weighted the data on the region of the country that people lived in, and then also these other 7 variables: age, category, gender, educational attainment, Hispanic status, vehicle ownership, income category, and whether people had children. So I really feel actually I'm doing all this lead up. I know you're interested in transit, but a lot of times people are really skeptical of survey data, and I just want to convince you that you should trust these data. We're going to get into the results now. So I'm going to talk about sort of 2 key results, and one of them is about remote work, and the other one is about car use and transit use for commuting. And those are obviously quite related. So what we found in our data, we asked a lot of questions about working from home. What I'm going to be showing you today, even though we have those 3 waves of the survey that I mentioned, I think all of the main slides I've got are really referring to the wave 1 data. But I can tell you that I've done the same analysis on the wave 2 and the wave 3 data, and the results only change very slightly, and I can talk about how they do change, and that's important that they haven't changed very much, for me to be. But I'm using this larger sample, the wave 1 data, because it is so much of a larger sample. So I feel like it gives us a more precise idea of what's going on. Anyhow, working from home. So we asked people what they did before the pandemic. We asked people what they did in the last week before they took the survey. So that's that COVID actual number or column. And then we asked people what they expected to be doing regarding remote work once the pandemic was no longer a threat. So we didn't give them a specific future date to think about. We said, when you're feeling comfortable, basically, if you're not feeling threatened by the pandemic anymore, what do you expect you're gonna do? And this is what we found. So this is a little bit of a simplified graphic, but because we asked more than just whether they'd work from home at least a few times a month. We have more specific data, and I think the next slide has a graph that shows that. But you can see that the pre-COVID actual working from home, at least sometimes, sort of regularly working from home, was about not quite a quarter of our employed respondents. And then the actual working from home in the last week when they took the survey was over 40%. And probably a little surprisingly, most of those people plan to continue to do so. And so this is a large change from the pre-COVID normal. And I think right now everyone's probably thinking, well, yeah, that's kind of what's happened. You know, we've been seeing all this stuff in the news. People are still working from home. We get it, you know. But this is what we found, and this is what we've seen in the news, and this is what we've seen in lots of other surveys. I think something like this is real. To give you an idea, though, about how this affects transit, and this is where I think our data is a little bit alarming and perhaps new to you, the transit commuters are much more likely to be saying they're going to work from home frequently than the non-transit commuters. And so that working from home story is even more prominent among transit commuters. And this is something that I think anyone involved in transit provision needs to be very aware of. They can't just look at the national data and say, oh yeah, working from home is going up. It's like, no, it's going up even more among your commuting riders. So you can see here compared to the non-transit commuters, and this is like the working, those percentages are for people working from home more than once a week. So it's like we asked if they'd be working for, I think the two categories that combines is every day or a few times a week. And so the non-transit commuters, that was 25% of people expecting that post-COVID, and among transit commuters, it's nearly 40%. This is just another slide. We can come back to this if people are interested in like the flows between, pre-pandemic and post-pandemic on work from home. But I want to make sure to get time to talk about actual commuting and transit. So what we found in terms of car commuting is that we are going to be expecting a decrease in car commuting. But it's an interesting type of decrease. It's not the type of decrease that you would necessarily find if you looked at, say, the National Household Travel Survey and you asked people what's their main commute mode, because people might still say, well, when I go to the office, I take a car. And you can see that like all of those different shades of purple are all, at least sometimes car commuters. But it's the ones that say, I'm going to take a car almost every day, that's really going down, right? So the always take a car is going down. Pre-COVID was nearly 70%. Post-COVID is the expectation is more like 55%, even though all of those people would say, well, when I go to the office, I take a car. And here are the transit numbers. So as we all know, most people don't take transit. So in our data, most people don't take transit. And so these numbers don't look very exciting, right? So pre-COVID, they rarely or never take transit for commuting was 92%, and post-COVID it's 94%. So that's gone up, but a 2% difference doesn't look like much. So I'm just gonna zoom in a little bit so we can see better. So zooming in on the bottom, the bottom part of that previous chart that just goes up to the 10%, you can see that it's actually a pretty big change. So we've got the always take transit used to be 6%, and it's going down to only 2% in our data. And the most days and some days don't seem to be changing quite as much. But that 6% to 2% of the always take transit is rather alarming. So what does this all mean? The first part of the story is there will be more telecommuting than there used to be, and we should expect that to continue. Here's just a few more notes on that I won't say out loud. And this is going to continue to have, I think, a profound effect on transportation, and especially on public transportation. And we did additional analysis with those bar charts of car commuting and transit commuting that I showed you to come up with some numbers in terms of percentage total change. So we project, based on our data, about a 15% reduction in car commute VMT, all of which comes from more telecommuting. There isn't much mode switching there, but some people, as I showed you, are moving away from car commuting. We expect there to be less car commute VMT. Now, of course, that doesn't mean less total VMT. It's just that people are driving for other reasons. And this is where it's hard, right? A 40 to 50% projected drop in transit commute trips per week. About half, or maybe a little more than half, comes from telecommuting increases, and a little less than half comes from mode switching, according to our best estimates. And just to remind you, of course, commuting is not the only thing to talk about when we think about transit, but according to the 2017 NHTS, about half of transit trips were commute trips. So this is a huge hit on transit. These are going to be obviously quite challenging for transit providers to think about as Brian started out this whole conversation, thinking about what does the future look like. But I want you to remember that it's not all bad, right? If workers can do their jobs effectively without commuting, that's actually a good thing, and we can think about how to restructure our services and our transportation system to serve trips that are perhaps more useful. And that's the end of my comments. I would just want to remind you, if you want to see more about our survey and our work, you can go to covidfuture.org, and thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, and good morning, and thank you for the invitation to be here. My role this morning in this presentation is to talk about the macro part of the demand for transit. And, we just saw some really interesting results from Deborah kind of across the country, but I'm going to change my presentation a little bit because two things came across my computer this morning. One was an article in the San Francisco Chronicle. It says, San Francisco expects office workers to stay remote 33% of the time. And then further on, it says that this could lead to a dramatic drop in BART ridership. And the other thing that came across this morning, let's see, let me bring that up, was from an opinion in Bloomberg. No one wants to hear it, but eventually you will all be commuting 5 days a week. Those don't match, right? And the reason why they don't match, I think, is because we're still in a pandemic. We're a far cry from 2020, but we're still in the pandemic. So we really don't know how this is going to play out. And it's one reason why a panel like this is really great, because we can discuss ideas and what we should look at to think about this. And when we get into the discussion, so I'm an advisor to the controller of the city of San Francisco, so I was in on the early discussions. And if you want later, we can talk about why I think that number, at least as it relates to transit, is really wrong. Although the 5 days a week, maybe not. So let's just jump into what are the overall trends that are going to affect the demand for transit. And the big one is aggregate economic activity, GDP. When I was in aerospace and doing modeling and forecasting of the demand for air travel, this was the most important thing, and it goes all the way through different modes of transportation. Income and growth in income correlates very highly with the demand for transportation of sort of all modes. And of course, what we're concerned with here is what is the substitution between public transit and other modes. But what you see here in the blue, those are actuals of GDP for the US. And in the second quarter of last year, we recovered to the previous peak. And if you just kind of draw a trend line there, and that's a 2.4% growth in GDP, we're back to trend by the end of this year, and we're going to actually go above trend as a result of increased productivity. So there's going to be really strong demand for moving around because people have jobs, they have income, and that means they want to move around. How they move around is important, but the demand, so the underlying demand is certainly there. And when we think about this, I'm probably going to go off my slides here for a moment, but GDP is determined by four demands. Consumption demand, and consumers are buying more today than ever. We're above trend. People have jobs, they have income, income's going up, and they feel secure in their jobs. The unemployment rate just dropped to 3.6%. So we have full employment. So consumption, 70% of that demand. Business investment, government, and net exports are the other parts of it. Business investment is up. Interest rates are very low. Real interest rates, adjusting for inflation, are negative. And businesses want to expand, and they're trying to invest as fast as they can. Also, you know about the labor shortage. Businesses are looking for capital goods that they can use to substitute for labor. That certainly affects leisure and hospitality, and so that's going to affect transit demand, as you just heard. It's those lower income folks that are more likely to be demanding public transit. And then we come to government. Government expenditure is not decreasing. In fact, as a consequence of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, defense budgets in the US are going up. That's certainly going to disproportionately affect California because we produce a lot of defense durable goods. And exports, well, Europe is going into a recession, but the European governments are going to be demanding more defense goods. And again, that's going up. So all of the components of this demand for GDP are there, and they're increasing. There's sort of no sign of weakness. There's nothing that's overbuilt. We haven't overbuilt houses or automobiles. And so we feel pretty confident that this forecast of above trend growth in GDP over the next 3 years has legs and has not very much downside risk. But this is something that, I started out by saying we're in the middle of a pandemic still. And so we have to be a little cautious in what we're thinking about, because what people say and how they feel and what they do can be really different. And what you see here in this picture, this is consumer sentiment. And I've circled over on the right, consumer sentiment today is as pessimistic as it was during the Great Recession. But consumers are unhappy, but they're very confident in their own jobs, and they're going out and spending. This is consumption, and consumption's above the past trend, or if you go back to the decade before, consumption's above that trend. So how people say they feel and what they do are oftentimes different. And when we get to the other side of the pandemic, we should be looking really closely, and hopefully your survey will continue, but we should be looking really closely as to whether or not they actually change their behavior. Okay, so moving on, businesses are flush with cash, so I already said that. Let's go to this. Where are these jobs? These jobs are in logistics, because we're buying a lot more, and we're buying a lot more online, and in technology. right? So the tech has been driving the California economy. It will continue to, and tech-centric states are going to grow faster than non-tech-centric states. But really the striking thing here is over on this side. These are the low-income jobs, and they represent, in terms of missing jobs, I didn't tell you what this chart is. This chart is the difference between, by sector, the number of jobs in pre-pandemic times to the latest data that we have. 80% of all missing jobs are in leisure and hospitality, retail, other services, which is personal care services, and these jobs are the kinds of jobs that require a lot of human contact, also healthcare, home health services. And these are also the jobs that are held by folks that you more than likely will see have a demand for public transit. Those are the missing jobs. Those are being replaced, at least somewhat, through automation. So that's an important part of demand, the driving of demand. Okay, so let me skip over to this. We do a survey of 8 markets in California, and it's a survey of developers. And what we're asking are questions that will lead us to conclude what their business plans are and what they intend on doing. And that dash line there, that 50, above 50 is expansion, below 50 is contraction. But also we found that important in predicting the future is the change in these indices. And if you go from left to right, this is the demand for office space. And you see, if you go from left to right, it tanked kind of in every segment. But look at, just for example, the San Francisco, which is all the way over on the left, right? San Francisco, huge amount of vacancies. Developers are seeing over the next 3 years a very dramatic increase in demand for office space in San Francisco. And if we just turn to, are they putting their money where their mouth is? This is a question about how many projects they're going to start on our panel. And so the red is Southern California, the blue is Northern California. Over on the right-hand side is 2021. Look at the blue. Northern California, our panelists, a larger percentage of our panelists are going to start new projects in the Bay Area to build office space than in any of the previous surveys, right? So they're looking at this return to the office. They're looking at the demand for office space and saying it's going to be larger and it's going to really grow. And they're betting on that. They're betting on that with their money. And so let me move ahead and talk about housing, because housing is an important component of the demand for transit, right? Where people live matters when it comes to moving around. And what we see here is these are rents across the country. The blue are a decline in rent, and the darker the color, the increase in rents. And you can see what I think all of you know is there's a movement off the coast and from the north and northeast to the Sun Belt and to the intermountain cities. Those are the ones that have experienced really high increases in rents. And so that changes, just like Deborah was saying, that changes the demand for housing. Some of this is work from home or work remotely, but it changes where people live and where that demand is going to be. And that's going to be differential across the country from what we saw pre-pandemic. But we're here in California, and we hear lots of things about the California dream is dead and everyone is leaving. And so let me just show you this quickly. This is, we're going to look at leaving San Francisco and going to Seattle, Boise, Nashville, and Austin. And leaving because of increases in home prices, the increases that, not the increases that you just saw, but housing in San Francisco is unaffordable, right? Well, it's becoming more affordable relative to other places, relative to these 4 cities. So what you see here, this is kind of a complicated chart. Let me just explain the result. We compared the median home price between San Francisco, that's on the left, and Silicon Valley on the right, to the median home price in these other cities, and looked at how that ratio changed over time. And now in some of these cities, such as Austin, the affordability has gone down by 30% or more. So sure, you can sell a home in the Bay Area and move to Austin and buy a larger home, but you'll get a lot less home than you got 10 years ago. And that means that at the margin, it's just less attractive. Okay? And just to show you what's being said in these places, so this is Boise, 300% increase in home prices in the last 5 years. The median home price in Boise, Idaho, is the same as in Sacramento, California. And I'll just quickly go through this. These are all much higher than in California. So the bottom line here is that eventually it stabilizes, that differential stabilizes. And we can see that with Los Angeles and Dallas. We all think that everyone's moving to Dallas, right? Well, it turns out that Dallas home prices and LA home prices have increased at about the same rate over the last 5 years. And the net migration has been only about 1,000 Californians to Dallas per year. So there's basically zero. And that means that although we see people moving because they're working remotely, moving out to the suburbs, then this mass movement that we've seen in this last year doesn't have legs to it. And so we expect that demand for moving around, for mobility in the state of California to still remain robust as California grows. And again, this is another survey, the same survey that you saw before, but this is on multifamily housing. Developers in multifamily housing are expecting people to be moving back into the city and living on transit corridors, and they are also out there building. So let me just conclude with that the underlying demand is strong, and the real issue is how are people going to move around? Is it going to be public transit, private cars, or otherwise? And so I'll just conclude with that, and thank you.
Before Mike goes on, I just want to make sure everybody is up and running on Slido. Do we need additionals? Is everybody up and running on Slido? No. I think we need additional Slido instructions. Thank you, Juan.
So you can go on your phone or mobile device to slido.com or sli.do. Type in Arrowhead, and you'll see 3 or so questions that your audience, your colleagues in the audience have already proposed. You'll be able to vote on those questions, respond to some of those questions, I believe, and also submit your own questions. And after Mike's presentation, Evie will ask a few questions, at which point we will turn over to the audience for questions, and we'll be calling on you to come up to this microphone. Molly, did you? Arrowhead. Okay. All right. So just one more time, because this is very important. We are hybrid, I guess, where we're both virtual with Slido, but also in person in this room. Slido.com, or to save your finger taps, sli.do. And then it'll ask you for an event code, which is Arrowhead. And then you'll see the stuff, and we'll be using this throughout the day. You can also submit ideas to be discussed during the final session from 4:30 to 5. So we'll explain that later. And while I'm up here, I will get this going. All right, so take it away, Mike.
All right, thank you, everybody. I don't have slides. And I probably won't talk quite as long as my fellow panelists. But I think what I want to start off by saying is that there's like a certain feeling of deja vu to this conversation, even though we are in obviously an unprecedented time, but we're coming out of this pandemic, hopefully, and we're standing here and saying, oh, you know, we're thinking about the outlook for transit, and it seems sort of grim and uncertain, and I agree that it does. I also can't remember a time a bunch of people got together to talk about transit where the outlook wasn't grim and uncertain. I think maybe in 1910, the transit industry was incredibly optimistic. And I think in part, and what I'm going to say here, I'm going to channel to some extent, so credit where it's due, to some things that I've been saying with Brian and Evie for the past few years. Even before COVID, transit was, you know, in some trouble, and people weren't sure what was going to happen to it. And to a great degree, that's because we have managed to avoid, over the course of decades in American transportation policy, deciding what exactly we want public transportation to do. And because we've never quite settled on what we think the mission of public transportation is, it just kind of drifts along in many ways as sort of an afterthought to sort of other more dominant ways of moving around. And that's not the fault of the people who run transit agencies, right? I mean, I think that they have a very hard task in front of them because our transportation system really is oriented so profoundly around automobiles. And then transit just gets other goals sort of mapped onto it as a matter almost of political convenience. And so I think it's, as a result of that, and as a result of the way the United States is laid out, it is really hard to make statements about what's going to happen to transit in the US, right? Because transit in the US is a very geographically uneven phenomenon, far more than driving, far more than air travel. 2/3 of the transit ridership in the United States happens in 6 metropolitan areas, right? Chicago, New York, San Francisco, Philadelphia, Boston, Washington. Was that 6? I never should have said 6 and then started to list them, but it is 6. 40% of the transit ridership is in New York, and that's in the New York metropolitan area, and most of that is in New York City, and most of that is going in and out of Manhattan, right? Which means that, you know, transit ridership could increase by 5% in almost every metropolitan area, which would be an unprecedented increase in transit ridership. But if it fell 10% in New York, American transit ridership would decline, and vice versa, right? So because we have these two very different, like American transit is actually 2 markets. It's these 6 metropolitan areas that are, they're sort of defined by being older, having sort of narrow street grids, having a scarcity of parking, having high density. And these are places where you see the most transit ridership and where you actually see higher income people regularly riding transit. And these are the places where, to Jerry's point, when you see GDP grow, you see more people riding public transportation, right? More people are going into downtown San Francisco on BART, they're going into Manhattan, they're going into downtown Boston. In the rest of the country, right, which is most metropolitan areas, but not most transit riders, transit is just a social service. It's, you know, to use an economist term, a kind of needlessly mean economist term, it's an inferior good, right? It actually, its use increases as income falls. And, you know, what makes it, and so that very much describes Los Angeles, right? In Los Angeles, on LA Metro, for their rider surveys, we know that in general, most years pre-pandemic, we saw that the median household income of a transit rider was about $18,000 a year, right? In a county where the median household income is about $60,000. And when you have a situation where transit is primarily a social service, you are always going to wring your hands about its future, because there's a tension embedded in it that basically says that for you to have ridership, some of the most vulnerable people in your region have to continue not doing well, right? And that's not really a goal you want, unless you need transit ridership. And so you have this situation where transit is basically a part of the welfare state, but has this odd component to it where, unlike the rest of the welfare state, its biggest boosters want more people to use it, right? If you talk to someone who runs the food stamp program or a supporter of Section 8 vouchers or something, in general, there's a hope, even if it's somewhat dim, that these programs are self-liquidating, right? That eventually, you know, we help people out so that eventually they don't need help, and then we just don't need this anymore, right? But transit serves that same purpose, but its biggest boosters hope that, unlike with welfare, where like the goal is that eventually no one needs it, the goal for transit somehow is that eventually everyone wants it, right? It's like the equivalent of someone who runs public housing saying that they hope everybody eventually moves out of private housing and moves into public housing. And the reason we have that is because we also have the second set of goals for transit, right? Which are less about transit and more about the recognition that we really can't keep driving as much as we do, right? So transit becomes this sort of proxy for less driving. And it's not necessarily a good proxy for less driving because in many parts of the country, the best way to drive less isn't to take transit, right? It's to find a way to walk somewhere or to carpool or just, find a closer destination that you would drive to rather than drive to a restaurant 8 miles away, you would drive to one 2 miles away. And so transit actually isn't very good at accomplishing that second mission of just like helping us drive less. It certainly isn't the most direct way to do it. In fact, in some ways, probably we want transit, we assign that role to transit because most of us actually don't want to drive less. And so we don't like policies that would actually really nudge us toward doing it. And we can just say, well, we're just going to put some more money toward transit. And that's probably going to continue because there's, the types of things that you would need to do to actually make transit a really viable competitor to driving are things that do take a long time and that we have been reluctant to embrace in most of the United States. And so again, if you look at New York City, if you look at Boston, if you look at downtown San Francisco, people don't ride transit there because they think the transit system is wonderful, right? Those transit systems are better than ours. But if, I grew up in Boston and it is a long-standing hobby to complain about the T, right? It's because driving in Boston is even worse and parking in Boston costs a fortune, right? And because in many instances, if you live in Boston, you just don't even have to have a car, right? You can make your trip by walking. And so I think that we're going to have to, at some point, if we want things to change, decide what exactly we want transit to do. We have it as a social service in most of the country, and that's extremely important. But the goals of having transit as a social service are different from the goals of using transit as an instrument to try and advance environmental policy. Because as an instrument to advance environmental policy, it can't be left on its own. It has to be paired with other policies. Policies that would somehow either explicitly or implicitly raise the price of moving around by car. And California has inadvertently started to move in that direction, right? By some of the state's land use reforms are going to help a little bit. So SB 9, for instance, which is going to help convert some areas near rail that are right now all single-family homes. They're probably going to turn over the next few years into fourplexes, and that will be helpful. Fourplexes that don't have to provide parking. But I think the larger, so we need sort of more of that. But I think the larger thing we need to do is, and I'll sort of wrap up here, we need to sort of get straight in our policy goals the difference between just having transit ridership, right, which is not actually an intrinsically valuable goal. Unless you run a transit agency, then it's super important because it's your revenue. But I say that with no disrespect or demean toward transit. Right? Like I ride transit here in most places I go, and why we want people to be on transit, and most of the time, that's because we want them to be driving less. And if that's really our goal, then you have to apply that goal consistently in your transportation policy and take it seriously, right? So we have tried for decades in Los Angeles to just put money into transit and hope that that leads to people driving less, and it has not worked, right? What we can do is try and put our sort of money where our mouth is and say, let's make people drive less, right? Because that's actually our goal if we want to meet our environmental goals, if we want to reduce traffic violence and the sort of needless injury and death that comes with it, if we want to just make our cities amenable to people who want to feel comfortable or feel like they have no choice but to move around in some way other than a 2-ton rolling sofa that is like a giant SUV or something. if you want to do that, right, you can push those policies, and you will find, as a byproduct, that you get more transit ridership. But I think right now, as long as you have sort of the cart before the horse, transit's always going to have a grim and uncertain future, pandemic or not. Okay, thank you.
Okay, first I want to make sure, is there anybody, raise your hand if we're still having Slido challenges, because now's the time to make sure that any questions that you've jotted down or have in your head, you post to Slido. Are we good on the Slido? Okay, Juan's going to make sure that everybody's good. And in the meantime, so I'm just going to ask a couple of questions. I'm going to then turn things over to you. So the three great talks that we heard sporadically touched on the issue of space and geography. So I want to make sure that everybody gets a chance to sort of think about their trends with respect to geography. So, Mike was talking a little bit about areas that are transit rich versus transit poor, areas where there's a lot of job growth, areas where there's not so much job growth. Housing markets that are very expensive, and we saw some of the up-and-coming housing markets and other sort of markets that are less expensive. And certainly there's variation in state policy as well. So I'm curious if the panelists can just talk about, in their neck of the woods and their sort of thinking about these underlying dynamics, how much variation we should expect to see by place. Who would like to start?
I can start. Do I push this thing? This one? No?
I steered you wrong.
You can always come up here too. This one seems to be working.
Hello? No. This way?
Yeah.
We have some microphone
Yes?
assistance.
Ooh,
We good?
awesome.
Okay, good.
Okay. Yeah, so the one thing I actually wanted to say or thought about saying and didn't say when I gave my presentation is that, so one of the things about doing survey research, if you're using a representative sample of people around the US, is that you don't end up with very many transit riders in your sample. As you saw, most people don't use transit. That's kind of a theme here. Most people don't use transit. And so that's why I didn't show you any slides or any numbers of, what did we find in LA or even California, as opposed to national numbers, is because we just don't have that many people in our sample that ride transit in LA. But that said, I did look at, among the relatively small number of people that we do have in California who said they were pre-COVID transit riders, and in the rest of the country, and then specifically in sort of the New York area, I looked to see if some of the numbers that I was showing you were really different across those areas. And in our data, they're not. And I was actually really surprised by that. And so then I just went ahead and showed you our national numbers, because I think they are pretty much on target for California and for New York and for everywhere else. It was rather surprising. But that is what I found when I dug into our data, specifically on this issue of transit ridership going forward.
That's on. So let me just say a couple of words about geography and transit ridership. I showed you a map and where we have seen migration in the U.S. Over the last couple of years since the beginning of the pandemic. And it's to these Sunbelt cities, none of which Michael mentioned. And if you go to Austin or Salt Lake City or Phoenix, you're not going to find much in the way of public transit. And however, where is there going to be job growth? The job growth is going to go to those tech-centric cities, Boston, New York, and the Bay Area, and those are 3 of your 6. So there's really going to be kind of this bifurcation of this demand. But the real growth in automobile traffic is going to be in the Sun Belt and in the Intermountain where people are moving. So if there's an environmental reason to be encouraging, and there is, to be encouraging public transit, we're moving in the opposite direction.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with what Jerry and Deb just said. I guess the only thing I would add is that, a pretty obvious point, which is that in terms of geographical variation and losing transit ridership, you can't lose it if you have none, right? So obviously we should expect, just in absolute numbers, some of the biggest losses to be in the biggest markets. And that's going to be especially true in large markets that don't have built environments that really strongly support transit. So we should expect, by that logic, big losses in Los Angeles, which is sort of an unusual transit market for being very, very large, but also still being not one of these kind of six, right? It's sort of the largest social service transit market in the country, which means that there's really nothing or very little that's pushing people onto a transit vehicle other than their own disadvantage, right? Whereas in New York and Boston and Philadelphia, it's the built environment is there and it's pretty stable and it's keeping people on board. So I think it really does, a lot of it does boil down to whether the infrastructure that's in place, street networks, density and so forth, is nudging people onto or off the transit vehicles.
So for those of you who know me, this question is not going to come as much of a surprise, but I'm curious about your thoughts, again, kind of in your areas, what the implications are for lower income families. And many of you touched on this, as part of your talks.
I'll take a stab at it. Well, in places, which is most metropolitan areas where the transit is relied on most heavily by low-income people, there's the departure of riders cuts both ways, right? On the one hand, probably a lot of people have left because they've managed to get an automobile, and certainly that seems to be true from work that we have done together in Southern California between 2000 and 2016. The price of used cars went way down, and it seems like a lot of households that would otherwise be on transit were able to get automobiles. That's good for them. They're just finally able to move around the way the rest of the people in their region are. That said, if the quality of transit service depends in part on how many people are using it, and there's good reason to think it is, then the folks who are left behind on those buses and trains, because they are doing a little bit better, are potentially worse off because maybe service won't be as frequent and things like that. And no one should interpret that as like, boy, we wish these lower income people hadn't gotten cars, right? I mean, I think I've said this before, and low-income people don't owe society good transit service, right? Society owes low-income people a way to get around, and so if we are concerned that as some low-income people get automobiles and leave buses, the bus service declines, it's up to the rest of us to step in some way and prevent that from happening.
Just a quick comment on that. The evidence that we have with respect to migration out of California is that it tends to be lower income people, and that's in part due to the high cost of housing. And so that part of the ridership, I think Michael is correct that we economists call this an inferior good, because if you have the money to buy a car and drive around, you do. And the real job loss in this pandemic has been amongst low-income folks and having a harder time to get by, looking for opportunities in growth cities are moving out. So that certainly is going to affect the demand in Los Angeles for transit.
Any comments?
So I think the only comment I could make based on our data is that some of less than half, but some of the reduction in transit ridership that our data suggests will happen or has happened and will continue is related to mode shifting, and most of that is mode shifting to vehicles. Again, unfortunately, this is a small sample size problem. I mean, I can't talk very much more about it than to say that, because once you start subdividing those people, I can't say much about what their income levels were or anything like that. But there is this, most of that was movement toward vehicle use for commuting, and there is also in our data evidence that people have acquired vehicles more than they've shed vehicles during the pandemic, for sure.
Great. I'm going to make sure you're posting your questions. I see that some of you have started to do that in Slido. I'm going to ask one more question, and then I'm going to open up the floor. So I was really interested in this question of whether the trends that we've heard about this morning have legs to them. And I guess Jerry's kind of focus on, what's going to happen on the other side of the pandemic. So I'm stealing your words. So I'm curious about your thoughts. I mean, you've all expressed really sort of powerful sentiments about these trends and about sort of transit ridership or the implications for transit ridership. And are these really here to stay? Who'd like to?
I'll start. This is where I really think so. I think people. I've had a lot of conversations with a lot of people about this because I keep presenting our data and people say no, really, but our employer's really gonna trust that, including Jerry here is gonna refute what I'm saying in a minute. I guess I will say that what the survey data we collected suggests is not that most people are going to. I mean, I think it's consistent with the data you presented, Jerry, on office space growth even. It's not that people are saying we're going to move to full-time telecommuting. It's that they're saying we want a hybrid, we expect to continue in a hybrid working mode mostly, and so they'll work from home 2 or 3 days a week and then work in the office 2 or 3 days a week. And so then they still need the office space, but they're also commuting less. And so you kind of get both. And that's how I imagine, based on our data and also based on talking to people, that things are likely to go, and so I stand by what I presented in terms of there being a lot less commuting via transit.
Okay, so I think you presented the challenge to me. I mean, I'm going to agree with that what you found in the survey, that people want a hybrid, and to the extent that that can happen, it in fact will happen, with an agreement between employers and employees. But I think about this a lot in terms of the demographics and what happened here at UCLA and our research institutes and the like. And, we started out working from home completely. The campus was shut down. And people couldn't wait then after a year or 15 months to get back on campus. However, we have found some more efficient ways to do some of the tasks that we do. And so you'll see people who are further along in their careers doing the hybrid. But think about the younger millennials and the Gen Zs who are coming into the market. What do they need in terms of employment? And they may say, sure, I'd like to work from home, can play some video games, do a little work, play video games. But what do they really need in their careers, and what are they going to go after? They need networking. They need mentoring. They need to be in locations where there are a lot of other firms that are doing the same kind of work that they're doing so that they have job opportunities. They need to be in front of their supervisors to get those pay raises and to get promotions. And their mentors need to be there to mentor them because mentoring over Zoom only partially works. And then the other thing that they need is these are folks that are in that time of life where they're looking for a partner. And so looking for a partner is, as we all know, not easy. And it's made a lot easier if you're in a social circle or many social circles after work, at lunch, and so on. And there have been a number of books written about urban economics, and one of the real attractions of a city for young people is the marriage market. And so Gen Zs and younger millennials are going to want to come into the office. And so I think we may be seeing something that's, relatively transitory, that we boomers are benefiting from this, but as time goes on. And then I have one other comment about the hybrid. Let's suppose that we do have a hybrid system. And remember that 33% number that I quoted for San Francisco. Well, are companies going to want to rent the same amount of space if they're only going to be in the office 3 times a week? What's the purpose of coming to the office? It's collaborative work, it's meetings, it's using these conference rooms and that kind of space. So they don't need the private offices except for HR stuff, and they can reduce the amount of space. Landlords then have an incentive to find someone else to occupy that space, and they'll do so by lowering lease rates. And if you think about a city like San Francisco, what firms in technology don't want to be where all the action is? And so you may have everyone working 3 days a week or 2.5 days a week, but you have a lot more people coming in. And so I think these are things that we should keep our eyes on, because the trends, and that was the nature of the question, do the trends have legs? I think we don't know. But there are a lot of reasons to think that the trends might not, and we might be seeing trends that we haven't never seen before coming to the fore. And remember that those younger millennials, that's the largest population cohort that we've ever seen. And they're really just getting started in their jobs.
Yeah, I'm not gonna make a firm prediction about this, but I think I'll make 2 observations. One is that I do think we have crossed some sort of Rubicon with respect to working from home, right? That before the pandemic, a lot of companies were just like, absolutely not, it's just not gonna work. And now we're over 2 years into those firms having kept their people at home, and they see that it's not a disaster, right? And there's a phenomenon in both physical and social sciences called hysteresis, which basically suggests that you bend something and hold it down, and then when you release it, it goes back up, but not all the way, right? There's a good argument in that respect for saying that we're going to go back toward normal, but yeah, there's probably going to be a lot more hybrid work than there was previously, just because we've gotten used to it, inertia is a powerful force, and so forth. But I do think, something Jerry said resonates, which is that workplaces, both within firms and across firms, they're defined by competition, right? People compete to get promotions and to move up, and part of that may involve just like being there, right? How do you want to get the promotion? You're the guy who the boss sees when she walks in first thing in the morning, and you're the last person she sees as she's walking out at night. And then similarly, to go back to the urban economics literature, there's a large amount of research strongly suggesting that firms get ahead through innovation. Innovation happens when people are clustered together and collaborating and doing face-to-face communication. And so if you do have situations where those competitive pressures just gradually put more workers inside each office, and then have each office wanting more people there for fear that if they don't, they're going to fall behind, then you could see some of the hybrid work get shooed away. I think one thing that really happened during COVID was something that that is not going to continue, of course, which is the government literally just said, everybody stays home of these firms, right? It's always important to remember that about 45% of workers, the whole pandemic, just they went to work. It was like a lucky few that didn't. But said, yeah, everybody stays home. And so if you keep your workers home, you aren't going to lose ground. And if you stay home as an employee, you are not disadvantaged in your pursuit of a promotion. With the stay-at-home order lifted, like, that game's back on. And so we just don't know how it will play out. But there certainly is a scenario where over time we get more and more people back in the office, just so that they don't so they maintain that competitive position.
Great. Okay, so now I think Jacob. So Jacob Wasserman, who's going to be moderating a session later this afternoon, is going to be facilitating our Slido questions. Yeah?
Is Tamika here? Feel free to come up to that mic, or later if you're asking a question, this mic, and ask your question.
Good morning. Thank you so much for that panel. I have a question that's up there. I was really distracted by the millennial video game comment, though, but I'll let it go.
Sorry.
And so I guess my question is, you all talked a lot about income, but I didn't hear as much about race in your comments, and I just saw a headline in Time, "No one wants to go back to the office as much as white men." Which I absolutely think is true. And I know there's some confluence between race and income, but I do wonder, when you're just thinking about race, how do you think that's going to impact the work from home trends in the future, and what that means for transit overall?
Thanks for that question. It's a really great one. And I can speak a little bit to that, but I would have to go into my data to give you like the numbers. But we did look at not necessarily race. Again, the transit rider sample is just kind of small, but overall in terms of work from home and wanting to go back in the office and how much people appreciate working from home. And you're absolutely right. We find that as well, that our non-white, but especially Black or African American survey respondents were somewhat more excited about working from home and intend to continue doing it as much as they, a bit more than our white respondents. One thing we did find that was encouraging on kind of the racial equity front was that, at least in our sample, well, at least for Black respondents, the Black respondents to our survey actually had quite a bit of opportunity to work from home during the pandemic and expected to have quite a bit of opportunity to continue to work from home. And the only group that really fell behind on that was our Hispanic respondents. But yeah, the people who that headline is what we found as well.
Yeah. Thank you.
So two brief comments. One is apologies about the millennial comment. I have a millennial daughter, and she and her friends are not that way. They are smart and ambitious and hardworking. But I kind of like the video game comment. But the other comment that I have, we don't have any data on minority office workers, but this pandemic recession hit, in terms of unemployment, Black and Hispanic workers more than any others. And what we're seeing is that they were in the service industries, and because they've been laid off for more than a year, and these are kinds of activities that are higher risk activities, such as being wait staff or working in a hotel, they're looking for other kinds of employment, and employment that pays more. And so we're expecting a shift of minority workers into higher paying work, and that's disproportionately females rather than males, because they were the ones who had the highest unemployment rate in the pandemic-induced recession.
Hi. So this is Joshua Shank. I have a question that's related to Michael's comments about transit being a social service, which is that if it is a social service outside of those 6 cities, it's not really being provided very well. And even within those 6 cities, as you said yourself, people tend to complain about it. So why are we using ridership as the metric for something that really is in large part a social service and is not succeeding at that goal particularly well?
I think there's probably 2 reasons. One is that although transit being a social service is I think the reality of service in those regions, few providers would explicitly say like that's the business we're in part because they also have been assigned a multiplicity of missions oftentimes from elected officials. And so, LA Metro is a great example. Again, overwhelmingly a low-income, non-white ridership that doesn't have access to personal vehicles. But at the same time, like having been assigned by the voters and by elected officials a huge suite of environmental and other goals. And so one could argue that ridership is a better metric for those goals that loom larger in the public mind. I think the other fact is just like a fact of management, which is just like you often use the benchmark that's easiest to count. And so it's a lot easier if you treat transit as a social service and see the goal of transit as a way to sort of move people up in the world, whether through higher income and then perhaps eventually leaving transit. That's a lot harder to track than just like how many boardings did you have. And of course, look, if you operate a transit system, boardings are an important metric, but I suspect it's some combination of those 2 things.
So I missed a beat. Make sure you introduce yourself when you ask the question. I'm sorry, I should have made that suggestion earlier. So,
thank you. Ryan Wiggins, follow up to Joshua's question. Just so you talk about what types of metrics you would actually want, that would better direct an agency's goals, planning, all of those things. So if you can't actually, some things, what could you measure in your mind? What are the best metrics for measuring outside of ridership that really get at what the goals of a transit agency would be ideally, which is, access to opportunity, those types of things? Because I'm from LA Metro, and we do have problems identifying really good metrics and tracking them from a way that can demonstrate what progress we are making or not making. So as a default, we often go back towards the ridership issue, which I think we all universally recognize is not the best way to go. But we do need to be able to really technically understand how to track establish metrics and work towards them. And so I would just like to, if you could expand on your comments a little bit more, that'd be helpful.
Sure. I mean, so on the one hand, I think that some of the things we want aren't things that are up to Metro, right? Like, so if the goal is to reduce driving, which I think the sort of shadow goal of a lot of these policies is, then you want to be measuring VMT and vehicular pollution and all that. And all that, the problem is all that happens outside the bus system and outside the transit system. So there's this fundamental mismatch where we assign that goal to Metro and then we're like, deal with it, right? Which is just, they can't. It's like, it's asking you to control everything that's not under your control. Now I'm just going to steal something that I've heard Joshua say to answer this question, which is that if you just want to know how well you're serving your riders, I mean, you should put yourself in the shoes of the rider themselves. And I know that when I go to the bus, I'm not thinking to myself, I wonder what ridership is today, right? I'm thinking to myself, when is this thing going to come? And so, I mean, the metrics that really talk about service quality are like how frequent is it, where does it go, how often does it run on time, and so forth. And in some ways, I think the mistake we've made is not even a mistake. The problem with using ridership is that if you had a firm in a very competitive market that was, really dealing with a lot of consumers who had a lot of choices, right, then ridership would tell you like, oh, you must be doing well on those metrics, right, because otherwise people would leave. But when you're dealing with a lot of people who don't have a lot of choices, then ridership might just be telling you something about the relative level of disadvantage in the region and rather than how well you're serving them. So a greater focus on just like, how long do people have to wait for the bus? How often does the bus see you and then mysteriously drive by? That happens. Things like that. So really actually just actual transportation performance metrics rather than counting numbers.
So we're going to do 2 last questions so we can stay on time. So next.
Hi, Herb Higginbotham. Deborah, I think you might have started answering this in your response to Tamika. But my question had been, the share of commuters who could not work from home on one of your charts was markedly higher for the transit riders in your survey than the non, which felt counterintuitive. And I was curious if you could just speak a little bit more, in light of what we hear about essential workers and the value of transit as a social service, or however we want to phrase that today. How did some of your data break down, by income, race, gender, other demographics? Again, I know you started to answer this, but if there's any more you could say on that.
Yeah, sure. Good question. So remember, we had a national sample, and nationally, most people don't ride transit. And yeah, I would have to look again at exactly what the breakdown of income and race among the people who did ride transit in our sample looked like. But yeah, mostly I think I would have to look again to see what the deal is. But in general, urban folks in our sample were more likely to be telecommuters or to become telecommuters during COVID, and that's where the transit is. So I think that's the breakdown. It's like urban-rural as opposed to the income story we've been discussing here in the national data that we have. So I think that's a big part of it, if that helps.
Hi, I'm Carolina Lecomte. I wanted to ask everybody, more like a marketing kind of thing for transit, is why do you think, or how do you think we could change the perception of transit instead of being an inferior good to being a normal good? And thinking more like in the example of European countries, where you get a more varied example of users from higher income races and across the population. And so how can we change that and do that in the US?
I presented only about my survey data. I do think about this kind of stuff too. I guess I would echo what Mike said earlier, which is think about it from the perspective of a rider. And if you provide great service to your riders, so this is a proposition I was thinking about before coming here. If transit agencies need to rethink who their riders are, and all the stuff that Mike said about, are we providing transit as a social service, or are we providing transit to help with some environmental goals? I mean, is there an opportunity to really try to double down on really thinking about it as not necessarily a social service, but just like who rides transit now? Let's provide the best service possible to those people and make it into as good a service as they have budget for. And then maybe other people would look at that and say, hey, actually, that's working pretty well. Maybe I'll try that out. Maybe that's crazy, but I'm very curious what you think.
So, I would add to that incentives, right? So it's an inferior good because other modes of transportation are more enjoyable to those who are using them. So one way to do this is to make it more expensive and less convenient to use, for example, private cars. And cities, for example, and there are not many examples, but some, like Singapore, that have zones where you have to pay to drive your car into that zone. It makes it less attractive, and it makes public transit more attractive. Or if you convert parking lots to housing so that parking is very hard and very expensive, then transit becomes a superior good or a normal good and not an inferior good. And it's driving that becomes the inferior good. So you just have to change the incentives for people, and they'll respond.
I agree completely with both of those. I guess the only thing I would say is that, or just observe, is that both those suggestions really do revolve less around how transit is marketed, and they just involve, substantial changes. Until you make those changes, you can't sort of persuade people that transit is the best thing for them, right? If the rest of the region's built environment is telling them that they should be in a car, you have to be an awfully convincing person, and then the message even then probably won't stick. So it really is I don't think it's a marketing problem so much as it is a real public policy problem.
Okay, we're going to bring this session to a close. Let's start by thanking the three presenters on this panel. I also want to sort of thank those of you who maybe some for the first time, sort of experimented with Slido and asked your questions, so keep on doing that. So thanks for your questions as well. And then just a reminder before I turn things over to Brian, who's waiting in the wings, is that take advantage of the lunch to continue sort of talking about these themes. Deborah suggested there's access to data, so you yourself can look at the data. So there's lots you could do to sort of build on this session. And certainly some of the sessions this morning and this afternoon, these themes will be carried forward. So thanks very much, and thanks to our panelists.